People who were nearly murdered. How did it happen, and how did you get out of it? Please leave a comment where you are watching in the world. Story 1. I worked as a bouncer for a couple of years, and let me tell you, it's not nearly as glamorous as the movies make it out to be. Most of the time, it's just standing around, checking IDs, and breaking up arguments before they turn into full-blown fights. But every now and then, things get out of hand, and that's when you really earn your paycheck. I had my fair share of encounters with drunkards who got a little too rowdy. Over time, I got pretty good at spotting trouble before it started. I also developed a knack for dodging thrown bottles, because yes, people do actually throw bottles when they're mad enough. I used to joke that my reflexes were sharper than my paycheck justified. Still, even with all the practice, nothing could have prepared me for the night I almost didn't walk away from. It started off like any other shift. The crowd was loud but manageable, and the drinks were flowing. Then I got the usual call to come and escort someone out, standard procedure for someone who'd had one too many and was starting to make a scene. I didn't think twice about it. I walked over, grabbed the guy's shoulder, and started leading him toward the door. Easy enough, right? Wrong. Before I even realized what was happening, I felt this sharp, searing pain in my thigh. It didn't register at first. I thought maybe I'd walked into something, but then I saw the knife. The bastard had stabbed me, quick and deliberate, like he'd been waiting for the chance. And as if that wasn't enough, he was already winding up for a second strike, this time aiming for my throat. I didn't even have time to react. All I could think was, this is it. But then, out of nowhere, there was this crash. The guy staggered back, blood streaming down his face, and I realized someone had just glassed him. Turns out it was one of the patrons, a guy who'd been quietly sipping his beer and watching the whole thing unfold. He didn't even hesitate. Just smashed his glass right over the guy's head and saved my life. By the time security and the cops showed up, the guy who stabbed me was out cold, and I was sitting in the corner trying to keep pressure on my leg. Ended up with a few stitches and a limp that stuck around for a couple of weeks, but honestly, it could have been so much worse. The guy who saved me? Absolute legend. He didn't make a big deal about it, just shrugged it off like it was no biggie. The only thing he was upset about was that he no longer had a beer. I remember him looking at his empty hand, shaking his head, and saying, "Well, now I've got no beer." That's a bit sad. We made sure he didn't have to buy his own drinks for the rest of the night, or any night after that, really. Anytime he came in, someone was handing him a pint before he even made it to the bar. It became this running joke that he was the guy who took down a knife-wielding maniac, and all it cost him was a beer. I think about that night a lot, not just because it was the closest I've ever come to dying, but because it reminded me how unpredictable people can be. One second you're leading someone out the door, and the next, you're bleeding on the floor. And then, just as suddenly, some random stranger steps in and saves the day. Working as a bouncer teaches you a lot about people. You see the best and worst sides of humanity, sometimes within the same hour. You learn to read body language, pick up on subtle cues, and trust your instincts. But no amount of training can prepare you for the truly crazy moments. After that night, I started carrying a bit more caution with me. I made sure to pat people down a little more thoroughly, and kept my guard up even when things seemed calm. It's funny how quickly one incident can make you rethink your entire approach. The guy who stabbed me ended up facing charges, of course. He tried to play it off like it was self-defense, but the security footage and multiple witnesses said otherwise. Last I heard, he was still serving time and good riddance. As for the guy who saved me, we stayed in touch for a while. Story 2. Got shot in the abdomen during a house invasion. It happened so fast I barely even registered what was going on at first. 1 second, everything was tense but manageable, voices raised, adrenaline pumping. And the next, there was this deafening bang, and I was on the floor. The pain didn't hit me immediately. I remember looking down and seeing the blood spreading across my shirt, and that's when it hit me. Panic, fear, everything all at once. I was bleeding out, and all I could think was, this is it. But then my buddy snapped me out of it. He crouched down next to me, smacked me across the face, hard, and said, "Nobody dies from a shot to the stomach. You hear me? Nobody." Obviously, he was lying. People die from stomach wounds all the time. I knew it. He knew it. But somehow those words stuck. They cut through the fog and gave me something to latch onto. I focused on my breath, in and out, just like he told me to. "Don't think about the blood," he kept saying. "Just breathe." He stayed right there, keeping pressure on the wound while yelling at someone to call 911. I don't know how long it took for the ambulance to get there, but it felt like forever. Every second stretched out, and the only thing that kept me from completely losing it was his voice in my ear, telling me to hold on, telling me that stomach wounds weren't fatal, no matter how much blood I was losing. When the paramedics finally arrived, I remember feeling this weird mix of relief and fear. Relief because help was finally there, but fear because part of me was still convinced I wasn't going to make it. They loaded me onto a stretcher, and my buddy climbed into the ambulance with me. He didn't let go of my hand the entire ride. Kept talking, kept lying to me about how I'd be fine, and I held on to those lies like a lifeline. The doctors at the hospital were incredible. I don't know how they managed to keep me alive with how much blood I lost, but they did. Surgery, stitches, and a lot of medication later, I woke up in a hospital bed with my buddy sitting in the corner, half asleep in a chair. He woke up when I stirred, looked at me and grinned. Told you no one dies from a shot to the stomach. Story 3. I got stabbed in the chest a few years ago during a fight with some bike thieves. It wasn't exactly how I thought my day would go. 1 second, it was just a heated argument, and the next, it turned physical. Everything happened so fast, punches, shoving, chaos, and before I even realized it, I'd been stabbed. The crazy part? I didn't notice at first. Adrenaline's a hell of a thing. My focus was on getting out of there, so I fought back, managed to escape the fight, and rode the bike away. I honestly thought I was fine until I felt something warm running down my side. That's when I stopped, checked myself, and saw the blood. A lot of blood. I rode straight to a nearby shop and sat down inside, trying to stay calm but feeling the panic creep in. I knew I had to keep it together. I pressed my finger into the hole in my chest, hoping it would help slow the bleeding, and called for an ambulance. It was one of those surreal moments where everything felt too quiet, like the world had slowed down, and all I could hear was my own breathing, and even that didn't feel right. The paramedics got there surprisingly fast, and once they checked me over, I realized things were worse than I thought. Turned out I had a punctured lung and blood pooling in the pleural cavity. Not exactly ideal, but at least I was still conscious, still breathing. The ambulance ride felt longer than it probably was, but I stayed awake the whole time, replaying what had just happened and trying to wrap my head around it. The hospital staff were incredible. They got me into surgery and patched me up. A few days later, I was sitting in that hospital bed with stitches and a chest drain, feeling like I'd been hit by a truck but weirdly grateful that it hadn't been worse. The doctors told me I was lucky. The knife had missed my heart and any major arteries. If it had been even an inch in the wrong direction, it could have been a very different outcome. As for the guy who did it, he didn't get away with it. The police caught up with him not long after, and he ended up going to prison. I heard later that he had a string of priors, so this wasn't his first run-in with the law. Story 4. My aunt was mugged and escaped it by giving the mugger a mom look and asking him, "Honey, is the $30 in my purse worth years in prison? Or having to live with the knowledge you robbed a terminal woman?" And the guy apparently put his knife away and skulked off. Weirdly, she's pretty sure she hired him to work at her shop a few months later. The terminal diagnosis turned out to be premature. A wonder surgeon managed to remove the tumor that was inoperable before it spread further. She did lose all her hair, though. The guy applied to work the night shift and was much cleaner, but she thinks it was the mugger. And because my aunt is who she is, she hired him anyway. And he/was a model employee too. She would be pissed if I didn't mention that. As far as I know, he's still working at her gas station, and last I heard, he was her night manager. No money goes missing, customers compliment his attitude, and she says that fate sent him to me twice, and I did my duty. Story 5. I was on a train during the midday in Chicago. Mostly empty train car. This dude moved over some seats to sit closer to me and said, "Yo man, you got a knife?" He pulled out a Michael Myers kitchen knife and said, "You need a knife to defend yourself on the train. You never know who's going to be crazy, you know." I have no idea how I stayed calm, but I just nodded and said, "Emichim." He put his knife away and just ignored me the rest of the trip. Maybe he wanted to fuck with someone that was afraid. In the moment, I think my brain just shut off and I barely acknowledged him in a panic. Looking back, it was terrifying, and I could have died that day if he was in a bad mood. Story 6. My ex-wife tried to hit me with a car 3 times. Not once, not twice, 3 times. I don't even know where to start with that, but it still feels insane every time I think about it. I'd be walking down the street, minding my own business, and out of nowhere, there she'd be, roaring out of a parking lot like something out of a bad action movie. It didn't take long for me to figure out that this wasn't random. She wasn't just running into me. No, she was deliberately waiting. I'd pass by a parking lot, and there she'd be, hiding between cars or pulled into a space, just waiting for the right moment. The scary part was how calculated it felt, like she'd mapped it all out beforehand. The first time, I didn't even see it coming. I heard the engine rev and turned just in time to see her car speeding toward me. I tried to jump out of the way, but she still clipped me hard enough to knock me down. Ended up in the hospital with a fractured arm, some deep bruises, and a lot of questions from the staff. The doctors kept asking if I felt safe at home, and all I could think was, home isn't the problem, it's the streets I have to watch out for. She didn't even stick around afterward. Just sped off and left me lying there. I don't know if she panicked or if that was part of the plan, but either way, it set the tone for what came next. The second time was less dramatic but no less insane. I was walking to a friend's place, staying aware of my surroundings like I'd started doing after the first incident, and sure enough, there she was. This time I saw her waiting. She was pulled into a parking spot, engine running, and the second she saw me looking at her, she hit the gas. I managed to dodge most of it, but she still caught me on the side, knocked me off balance and sent me sprawling, but thankfully nothing was broken that time. Just some bruises and scrapes, and a whole lot of anger. The third time, though, that's what really messed with my head. I was convinced she wouldn't try again, that maybe she'd calmed down or moved on, but no. I was wrong. She came at me one more time, and this time I was ready. I saw her before she even turned the wheel, and I ran. Full sprint. I could hear the tires screeching behind me, but I didn't stop until I was completely out of sight. After that, I started changing my routine, taking different routes, avoiding areas I thought she might know, and even walking in groups whenever I could. It felt ridiculous, like something out of a thriller movie, but it also felt necessary. I wasn't about to give her a fourth chance. Story 7. My ex-boyfriend was abusive the entire time we were together, but it culminated in him trying to strangle me with an electric cord. Our elderly neighbor randomly knocked on our door because she needed help shoveling her driveway, snow, right as I was starting to lose consciousness. He was a police officer, so he had an appearance to keep up and immediately switched his mask back to answer and go help her. I found out later when my ex left for his overnight shift that she had long suspected something bad was happening because she would see me with bruises and gotten a bad feeling out of nowhere that night, and that is why she came over to ask for help. She called her son to take me to the hospital, and that was when I was finally able to leave him. I will always consider her my guardian angel. Side note for anyone reading this, if a partner ever makes you feel unsafe, leave. Make a safety plan in GTFO. They will always do it again, and it will always get worse. For further context, I was 16 years old, and he was 26. I had been kicked out of my house, whole different story, and he swept in and saved me. I, naively and ironically, thought I would be safe from my abusive family situation with a police officer. This situation was indeed reported by ER staff, as I was a minor, and did eventually give his name. This happened in a smallish township where the whole department were his co-workers. Many charges were technically filed, but he was never actually arrested, and everything was dropped after alibis were provided by his co-workers, and a general cover-up was done. I made a post on a DV sub about the situation a while ago that included snippets of some of the reports as proof, but it kinda blew up, and I deleted it out of fear he'd somehow find it. I was granted a short RO basically as a STFU measure, but he would still have other officers bother me around town and harass me with fake numbers so nothing could ever be directly linked to him. Then the second it expired, he began physically stalking me again. It has been many years. I have since moved over halfway across the country, changed my legal name, changed my number at least a dozen times, and if you were to look my name up online, it's like I don't exist. He still will pop up occasionally with a random letter or spam text from fake numbers as a little, "Hey, I'm still here and watching you, I guess." It doesn't affect me much anymore, as crazy as that may sound. You become numb to it. I've basically had to accept that he will probably never fully leave me alone. Moral of the story is again, leave and don't look back. No matter what gender you and the abuser are, no matter what ages, no matter how bad, the abuse is no matter what. Story 8. My ex-husband attempted to strangle me to death, too. He'd always been abusive, but never to that level. I woke up to him on top of me, with his hands around my throat, telling me I was going to die. I fought back, I ran, and he caught me on the stairs. We struggled, and he kicked me. As I lay dazed at the bottom, He smashed my phone over the banister, RIP BlackBerry with a physical keyboard, and then went for my throat again. I don't recall how I escaped that time. I do recall running out the back door screaming. A neighbor had lights on and let me in. I used their phone to call 911. He was arrested and charged and released the next day. I took him back about 2 weeks later. He was so sorry, and I was so afraid financially. He promised to take his antidepressants. He promised he'd stop using cocaine, lie down with dogs and get up with fleas. His friend group weren't great, and when lockdown happened in March of 2020, he joined them in their vices. Who gets addicted to cocaine at 45? Once the restraining order was dropped, he reverted back to his old ways. Immediately, advancing on me, making light of his attack. Doing laundry one day, I found a very tightly rolled up $5 bill. I finally, eventually, understood that he wasn't trying to be better, and that I would die if I stayed. His girlfriend messaged me via Facebook 2 weeks after he pled guilty to assaulting me. He got probation, telling me how abusive he is. They're still together, as far as I am aware. And me? I'm thriving and living my absolute best life. I have peace. I hope you have the same peace. Story 9. I was coming home from my restaurant job at around 2 a.m. It had been a long shift, and all I wanted was to grab some snacks, head home, and crash. I stopped at a sketchy Walgreens, one of those places that always feels a little too quiet and a little too dimly lit at that hour. But it was the only thing open, and my craving for chips and soda won out over any hesitation. I grabbed my stuff, paid, and headed out to my car. As I was unlocking the door, I suddenly heard someone shouting behind me. My friend! My friend! Please, you must help me. It startled the hell out of me. I spun around and saw this big guy running toward me. He had a thick Haitian accent and looked frantic, almost panicked. Before I could say anything, he started talking fast. He explained that he had just arrived from Haiti, was separated from his family, and desperately needed a ride to his friend's house to reunite with them. This was right after the massive earthquake in Haiti, so his story seemed plausible enough at first. But something felt off. Way off. Normally, I try to help people whenever I can. I've given strangers rides before, and always felt like it was the right thing to do. But this guy, he was jittery, sweating, and his eyes were darting around like he was either paranoid or high on something. The more he talked, the more my gut was screaming at me to get out of there. I politely declined and told him I couldn't help. That's when his demeanor changed. He went from desperate to aggressive in seconds, stepping closer and raising his voice. I didn't wait to find out where the conversation was headed. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and peeled out of the parking lot as fast as I could. Even as I drove away, my hands were shaking. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting him to somehow be following me. The whole encounter left me rattled, but I tried to brush it off as just a weird late-night situation. The next morning, though, I turned on the news and saw his face. My stomach dropped. It turns out that after I left, he managed to convince 2 young girls to give him a ride. At some point during the drive, he pulled out a knife and forced them to keep going, about 100 miles away. When they stopped on a deserted side road, he attacked them. Stabbed both of them. One of the girls didn't survive. The other managed to run away and get help, but not before witnessing what must have been the most horrifying experience of her life. The guy didn't make it much farther. When the police caught up with him, he tried to run, and they shot him. He died at the scene. Story 10. I was 21 when it happened. It was a murder-suicide attempt. He drove me into a river at 2 a.m. on a below-freezing night, about 30 miles from town. I still don't fully understand why he did it, and maybe I never will. I was asleep in the passenger seat. I had no idea what was coming. 1 second I was out cold, and the next, icy water was rushing into the car, hitting my legs and jolting me awake. It took a few seconds for my brain to catch up with what was happening. The car was sinking fast. The doors wouldn't budge, the water pressure had already pinned them shut. My heart was racing, but somehow I managed to stay calm enough to realize the windows were still down. That was our only way out. I shoved him toward the window and climbed out right after. The water was bone-chilling, stealing the air from my lungs, but adrenaline kept me moving. I didn't even have time to process the fact that he'd just tried to kill us both. I just focused on getting us to shore. When we finally dragged ourselves out of the river, he collapsed on the bank and started sobbing. I stood there shivering, half frozen and soaked to the bone, while he kept repeating incoherent apologies. He was hysterical, crying, rambling, and completely falling apart. Meanwhile, I was trying to wrap my head around what the hell had just happened. I wanted to scream at him, but there wasn't time for that. We were in the middle of nowhere, miles from civilization, and I knew we had to keep moving if we were going to survive the night. So I pulled myself together, forced him to get up, and started leading us through the woods. It felt like we wandered forever. Hours passed, and my legs were getting weaker with every step. I didn't realize it at the time, but my ACL was torn, and every movement sent sharp pain shooting through my knee. The cold made it worse. My clothes were soaked, and the temperature was dropping fast. Hypothermia was already setting in, but I couldn't let myself stop. Eventually, we stumbled upon a farmhouse. I don't think I've ever felt more relief in my life. The owners were shocked when they saw us, two half-dead, soaking wet strangers showing up in the middle of the night, but they didn't hesitate to help. They gave us blankets, called for an ambulance, and let us warm up inside. I was mostly fine, all things considered. Hypothermia and a torn ACL were bad, but it could have been so much worse. He was physically okay too, but mentally? That was a different story. I remember sitting in that farmhouse, staring at him while he kept apologizing, and finally snapping. I told him to kill himself and leave me out of it. I didn't even feel bad about saying it. After what he'd just done, I didn't have it in me to comfort him or pretend like any of it was okay. I never spoke to him again after that night. I blocked his number, cut off all contact, and did everything I could to erase him from my life. We weren't together, not romantically or otherwise. We were just friends and former roommates. I still don't know why he wanted to take me with him. I've gone over it in my head so many times, trying to find some kind of explanation. Was it loneliness? Desperation? Some twisted sense of companionship? I'll probably never know, and maybe that's for the best. Story 11. I was 7 years old when it happened. It started quietly like any other day. We were sitting in class, probably coloring or working on simple math problems, when the lockdown alarm went off. At first, we didn't really understand what was happening. We'd practiced lockdown drills before, but this felt different. Our teacher's face changed immediately. She tried to keep her voice calm as she told us to get down, stay quiet, and move to the corner of the room, but even at 7 years old, I could tell she was scared. What we didn't know at the time was that a man had entered the school with a knife. Not just any man, he was the father of one of the kids in our class. He had already killed his wife earlier that day, and was now looking for his son. But when he couldn't find him, he turned his rage on everyone else. He threatened to kill the entire class if they didn't bring his son to him. The details of what happened outside our classroom door are still fuzzy to me, but I remember the fear. I remember the sound of adults arguing, raised voices, and something crashing in the hallway. At one point, I peeked out from behind a desk and saw him through the tiny window in the door. He looked wild, like a man completely unhinged. He had a knife pressed against someone's grandmother's throat. I'll never forget the way he screamed, "I'll kill them all. They're already dead." It didn't make sense at the time, but it didn't have to. All we knew was that he was dangerous. Our teacher did everything she could to keep us calm. She whispered stories and quietly handed out coloring sheets to keep our hands busy, but the tension in the room was suffocating. Every sound outside made us jump. Some kids cried quietly, others just sat frozen. I remember feeling like the world had shifted into something unreal, like a movie scene I couldn't escape. Eventually, the police showed up. I didn't see them take him down, but we heard the commotion, yelling, footsteps, and finally silence. It was hours before they told us it was safe to leave the room, but even then, it didn't feel real. Parents showed up in droves, crying and hugging their kids. My mom nearly crushed me when she pulled me into her arms. Later, we learned the whole story. The man had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. He'd stopped taking his medication because he couldn't afford it, and he spiraled. He genuinely believed the world was ending and thought he needed to kill his family to save them from suffering. After killing his wife, he went to the school looking for his son, and when he couldn't find him, he snapped. After the school incident, he fled the state and was caught in Indiana, apparently on his way to kill his parents. It's chilling to think about how much worse it could have been if the staff hadn't managed to talk him down and keep us safe. Story 12. Was basically a functional light drug addict when I was a teenager. An acquaintance and I were held against our will, and she didn't make it. I did. It took 3 days. It was a normal day. Went out with a friend and 2 acquaintances to a relatively normal house, but our drinking water was drugged. Ended up at the other friend's house. I realized once we got inside that there were no doorknobs, windows were nailed shut, etc. Phones and clothes were taken, The other girl was far more gone and already working the streets. I never did. So they'd take her out and bring her back. Was beaten up pretty badly, drugged out of my mind, etc. Stopped fighting back. They didn't take me out of the house, except to lock me in a shed sometimes. I pretended to be more drugged than I really was and listened to what the guys talked about. It was where to leave our bodies. One day she and the other two were out doing what she did, the guy watching the house, and me, fell asleep. He'd been strung out for days and had just failed at a suicide attempt in front of me, so it was a deep sleep. They hadn't locked me in the shed that day, but left me in the main house as I'd become compliant and learned to act more drugged than I really was. Got my phone out from under the guy. They were trying to make it look like I left of my own accord / throw off friends and family. Charged it for 10 minutes while I found someone else's clothes and shoes. Ripped out most of my fingernails getting a window open. Ran until I couldn't breathe, called for help. And got clean. Over a decade ago. The other girl was never seen again. Story 13. When I was an early teenager, I went to a friend's house whose older sister was having a party. It had alcohol, but very limited. Her parents were home, and we mostly played video games and cards. But more people than expected showed up, including some people who had already graduated. This one guy was a former high school jock loser, who started in on making fun of me / hitting on me. The parents asked him to leave and he did, making a bit of a fuss but eventually walking out. I was all upset and crying and wanted to go home, but home was a mile-ish walk through some woods and dark roads, so her parents told me they would drive me home in a bit when the party was over. I was still upset and I was very dumb, so after a bit, I snuck out and walked home. A few hundred yards from my house, someone hit me with something. I was told it was a baseball bat, and stabbed me in the stomach several times. I do not remember any of this, nor do I remember someone finding me bleeding in a ditch and taking me to a hospital. If I had been there for much more time, I probably would have bled out and died in a ditch. Story 14. When I was 18, my ex-boyfriend stalked me and basically ambushed me in a municipal parking lot in my small hometown as I was unlocking my car to get in and go home. He punched me in the face twice, and I decided to just be compliant and go with him. It was broad daylight, and there were other people in the parking lot, but either they didn't notice or didn't want to assist. I won't go into minute details here unless some really wants to understand the ins and outs of why someone you know might do this to you. But he brought me to his parents' house, where he sexually assaulted me and stabbed me 27 times over a period of 4 hours. I survived by not speaking a single word to him the entire time, and not reacting to anything that he did to me. I innately knew he wanted to cause me pain, and I disconnected myself from the pain and emotion purposely, so not to give him anything at all. He eventually stopped and fled, and just left me there. When I was sure he was gone, I got dressed the best I could and started walking on the road where a guy I went to high school with previously, we had both already graduated, picked me up and drove me to a friend's house in town. I lived in a rural Wisconsin town. I stayed at her house for over a day before she convinced me to go to the hospital. I was afraid my parents would be angry with me, which was why I was hesitant. They cleaned and debrided my wounds best they could, but because I had been walking around like that for so long they couldn't do much more than that for me. My wounds didn't go deep enough to hurt my internal organs, but many did cut into my muscle layers. Yes, I had extensive scarring over my torso for a large part of my life until I was able to have cosmetic surgery to remove a lot of my damaged skin and muscle in my chest and abdomen when I was in my 30s. Nothing happened to my stalker. Stalking laws were not something that were a common thing in 1990. No charges were pressed. My attacker stayed low for a few years in Minneapolis, and then moved back to my hometown area, where he married a couple of times and had 5 daughters. About 15 years ago, he reached out to me on FB and wanted to be friends. My father didn't want any charges pressed and felt that I had gotten what I deserved for dating the guy in the first place. My mother went along with what he wanted. We never spoke about what happened to me ever again. It was up to me to work through on my own. My dad is dead now, and my mom has apologized to me in her own way. I don't speak with her about it to this day because she feels so guilty and horrible, and I honestly do not want to do more to her that would make her feel that way. She somehow felt controlled by my dad for many years until she divorced him after 35 years of marriage. I've gone to therapy in the last 15 years of my life, and it helped, but most everything I've done to survive and live has been based on spending a lot of my time being honest and introspective of myself, trying to become as much of an expert on myself as I can. That started the minute that I got into the car with him, and we headed out to his parents' house, and it hasn't stopped since. I survived by not giving my attacker what he wanted, despite being compliant with what he asked.